6 men built their legends on one excuse: that they had no other option. That excuse hid affairs, gaslighting, and children left to fend for themselves behind the polish of respectability and success. But somewhere on this list, one of them finally says the quiet part out loud, and it changes how you hear every apology that came before him. Don Draper, Mad Men. He built his entire adult life on a corpse, not metaphorically. Somewhere in a Korean field in the early 1950s, a lieutenant named Don Draper died in a mortar accident, and the man crouched next to him swapped the dog tags before anyone could check. Dick Whitman walked away wearing a dead man's name, and he never took it off. That's not backstory. That's the whole show. Wearing a disguise the way Don wears his. Every version of Don Draper you've ever admired, the sharp suit, the killer pitch, the effortless cool, is built on top of desertion and fraud that would end most men's lives before they started. He didn't stumble into success. He stole the launch pad for it. And once you know that, everything else starts to look like the same move performed over and over. Don doesn't just have one secret identity. He builds new ones constantly with anyone who gets close enough to threaten the first lie. Rachel Menken, Midge, Sylvia Rosen. 2 wives across 7 seasons, Betty and Megan, both fed the same diet of charm, deflection, and outright gaslighting whenever the truth got too close to the surface. He doesn't cheat like a man with a weakness. He cheats like a man maintaining a cover story. The cost of that maintenance lands hardest on the one person who never signed up to pay it. In season 6, his daughter Sally opens a door she shouldn't have and catches her father mid-affair with Sylvia. She's a kid, she doesn't get a metaphor, she gets the actual image, and it never leaves her. That relationship doesn't recover. It just learns to survive at a distance, which is its own kind of quiet damage that never shows up on a body count. Because Don doesn't hit anyone. Don sells them. His signature pitch, the carousel, is a slide projector rebranded as a time machine, built entirely out of the ache of nostalgia and loss. He stands in a boardroom and monetizes the exact kind of family longing he's actively failing to provide at home, and the room weeps in the account books. That's the trick. He doesn't just feel pain badly, he packages it and sells it back to the people who trust him most. Add the benders, add the drunk driving, add the nights his kids get parked with a neighbor who barely knows them while their father disappears to go feel something. None of it's a crime scene. All of it's neglect with better lighting. So the show hands you a defense before you can even ask for one. He's a product of a repressed, image-obsessed era, a man performing masculinity so hard he forgot there was a person underneath. It's a tidy read. It's also too tidy for a man who chooses deliberately over and over across 2 decades and 2 marriages to lie to the people who love him rather than risk being known by them. That's not a symptom of the times, that's a preference. He gets to keep the corner office anyway. He gets to keep the name. Don's damage stays behind closed doors and inside marriages, always deniable, never bloody. But the next man up couldn't hide behind a suit and an office because his family business didn't run on lies and advertising. It ran on something a lot harder to disguise as love. Jax Teller, Sons of Anarchy. A kid pulled the trigger, but Jax Teller supplied the gun. That's not metaphor. That's a literal Sam Crow firearm, sold through the club's gun-running operation, ending up in the hands of a boy who walked into a school and started shooting. Jax didn't pull that trigger, he just built the entire supply chain that put the weapon in reach, and then kept running it after he found out what it could do. By season 4, Jax is president of Sam Crow, and the official story is redemption. He's the guy who wants out. He's got his dead father's manifesto in a shoebox, all these handwritten pages about turning the club into something cleaner, something that doesn't bury its own members in the desert. That's the surface read. Jax Teller, reluctant criminal, trying to steer a runaway train he inherited instead of built. The gun-running numbers alone make that read hard to swallow. Cartel drug distribution, extortion rackets across multiple charters. This isn't a man minding a small-town garage that occasionally does something shady on the side. This is a functioning criminal enterprise with Jax at the top of the org chart and every rung below him answering to his decisions. Then look at who's actually dying because of those decisions. Rival gang members, sure, that's the cost of doing business in this world. Law enforcement informants, also expected, but Jax orders the execution of his own stepfather Clay Morrow in season 6 after spending an entire arc engineering Clay's downfall piece by piece, stripping him of the gavel, the club, the protection, before putting a bullet in him. That's not defense, that's a slow, deliberate dismantling of a man followed by a kill shot. And then Juice. Juice Ortiz was Jax's friend, a patched member, a guy who bled for the same table Jax sat at. In season 7, Jax has him killed in prison, arranged through the Aryan Brotherhood, not in the heat of some ambush, but as cleanup. Loose ends, a body removed by other men's hands because a living Juice was inconvenient to what Jax needed to protect. Somewhere in there, the stepfather he executed for being a liability starts looking less like a monster and more like a preview. This is the same machine Don Draper ran in miniature, except Don's wreckage stayed inside 4 walls and a handful of relationships. Jax's wreckage walks into a school. A child dies because Jax Teller wanted his family protected, and protecting his family meant guns flowing out the back door with no way to control where they landed. That's the whole lie laid bare. Every one of these men swears the empire is for the people he loves, and the people who actually pay for it are strangers who never signed up for any of it. By the finale, Jack seems to understand exactly what he's built. He orchestrates more murders on his way out the door, cleans up Charles Borowski, cleans up August Marks, sends his sons somewhere far away from all of it, and then rides his motorcycle straight into an oncoming truck. Fans love to frame that as accountability, the good man finally paying his debt in full. But a dead child doesn't get resurrected because the man who armed his killer decided to stop existing. The suicide reads less like justice and more like the only exit Jax could find that let him stop choosing, because every other choice he'd made had already proven what he was capable of. Jax at least got his hands dirty and paid for it himself, but the next man learned the real trick of power: never touch the body. Let someone else carry the gun while you keep the office, the smile, and the illusion that you're one of the respectable ones. Nucky Thompson, Boardwalk Empire. Nucky Thompson never fired a gun himself if he could help it. He never needed to. He owned the county treasurer's office, which meant he owned the judges, which meant he owned the very definition of what counted as a crime in Atlantic City. He didn't break the law, he decided what the law was. That is a different kind of dangerous than a man with a pistol. A guy with a pistol can be arrested. A guy who appoints the police chief cannot. The obvious pitch is bootlegger with good tailoring. From 1920 to 1933, Nucky ran prohibition liquor through the boardwalk like it was a public utility, splitting territory with Chalky White, and sitting at the table with Al Capone and Lucky Luciano like they were fellow board members at a normal, boring corporation. He rigged elections with the same casual confidence he used to order a drink, installing puppet candidates and bribing his way past anyone who might ask questions. When Jimmy Darmody got too ambitious, Nucky moved on him. When Arnold Rothstein's people got in the way, Nucky moved on them too. Somewhere around season 2, you stop counting the bodies and start counting the favors that made the bodies disappear legally. That already puts him ahead of a street thug with a temper. A street thug gets caught eventually. Nucky built a system where getting caught was structurally impossible, which meant every murder he ordered came with its own government-issued alibi. He wasn't hiding from the law, he was the law, which is a much cleaner way to get away with everything, but the killing was never the worst thing he did. The worst thing he did with paperwork and patience. The final season flashes back to the 1910s and shows Nucky as a young deputy delivering a teenage Gillian Darmody to the Commodore, a man decades older, in exchange for political favor. Not in a rage, not in a moment he lost control of. Calmly, as a transaction, the way you'd hand over a set of keys. Gillian's entire adult life, the abuse, the addiction, the son she raised in the wreckage of what was done to her, traces back to one calm decision Nucky made before he was even powerful enough to need to make it. That reframes everything else in the show. The gang wars, the speakeasies, the election fraud, all of it is Nucky, protecting a respectability that was rotten at the foundation before he built the first floor. He spends 6 seasons trying to go legitimate, buying real estate, courting Florida developers, dressing the part of a reformed man who left the ugly stuff behind. And the show keeps cutting back to the one act he can never rezone his way out of. No matter how many press appearances he manages, that is the part that separates him from the mobster with a machine gun in a car. Capone is loud evil, everyone sees it coming, and everyone knows to duck. Nucky is evil with a receptionist, evil that files paperwork, evil that gets invited to city council meetings and shakes hands on the way out. He built an entire office whose actual function was making sure his worst act stayed a rumor instead of a headline. Somewhere in a filing cabinet that's just categorized as overhead, and somebody paid for that respectability. Gillian paid for it. She paid in decades, not dollars, with interest that never stopped compounding. Nucky never called it a mistake, he called it politics, which is apparently the industry term for handing a child to a predator and filing it under expenses. That is the difference between a man who says he had no choice and a man who built the machine that guarantees nobody can prove he did. He hid it in the past and buried it behind a government seal. But the next man on this list didn't have an office to hide behind, and he didn't have decades to bury it in. He had to do it himself up close to someone who trusted him completely, and watch it happen in real time. Tony Soprano, The Sopranos. Tony Soprano is the first man on this list who had a professional whose entire job was to help him understand himself, and he used her anyway to become a better liar. Every guy before him needed distance to kill. Systems, orders, men who did the actual dirty work 3 steps removed, layers of paperwork and hierarchy standing between them and the blood. Tony collapses all of that down to a pillow and his own 2 hands. No middleman, no plausible deniability. Just him, in the room, doing it himself. On the surface, Tony Soprano runs a normal criminal empire, boss of the DiMaio family in New Jersey, running racketeering, loan sharking, gambling, and extortion, while the FBI builds a case against him from practically the pilot episode. That part is almost boring. Mob boss does mob boss things, you've seen the poster. Guy in a bathrobe ducks in the pool, panic attacks he doesn't understand yet, then you watch what he actually does with the people who love him. In Season 5, he executes his own cousin, Tony Blundetto, with a shotgun, not because Blundetto betrayed him, because Phil Leotardo wanted blood and Tony needed the war to stop. Family, sacrificed for logistics. Cousin gets killed so the spreadsheet balances, and it gets worse from there. Season 6, Christopher Moltisanti survives a car accident. Tony looks at the man he raised, the nephew he called a son, and smothers him to death in the wreckage. Quietly, efficiently, because a drug addict with a loose tongue and law enforcement circling was, in the end, a liability that needed removing. That's it. That's the whole calculation. He calls it love the whole time. He cheats on Carmela across the entire run of the show, lies to her face, performs the devoted husband at every christening and backyard barbecue, and somehow that is not even the most disturbing part of his home life. The most disturbing part is that he goes to therapy for it, weekly, consistently, is sitting across from Dr. Melfi, unpacking his panic attacks, his mother, his childhood, actually getting close to real insight into why he does what he does. And he uses every single ounce of that insight to become more comfortable doing it. That is the detail that separates Tony from everyone stacked below him on this list. The earlier men could tell themselves they never really understood their own darkness, that ignorance was doing some of the work for them. Tony doesn't get that excuse. He sits in a room with a trained psychiatrist for years, staring directly at the machinery of his own cruelty, and instead of dismantling it, he learns how to oil it. Self-awareness becomes just another tool in the kit, right next to the guns and the shakedowns. Add that to the list of things therapy was apparently not built to fix. Fans have spent years arguing about whether Tony ever actually grows. Some point to the flickers of guilt, the moments he seems genuinely shaken by what he's done, and ask if that's the beginning of a man trying to change. It isn't. Every flicker of guilt gets absorbed back into the pattern within an episode or two, and the murders keep happening on schedule regardless of how he feels about them afterward. Guilt in Tony's world is just weather. It passes. The show even ends without telling you whether he ever pays for any of it, cutting to black mid-sentence, leaving the entire question of judgment hanging open forever. That ambiguity isn't an accident. It's the show refusing to let you off the hook with a tidy verdict, refusing to hand you the closure of watching him get what he deserves. And somewhere in that ambiguity is Carmela, staying for the money and the house and the version of him she's convinced herself is real. Somewhere in it is Christopher, who trusted the man smothering him right up until the pillow came down. Somewhere in it is Blundetto, who never even got to argue his case. Tony at least knew he was a bad man, and he never once dressed the killing up as righteous. He wasn't operating under some code, some higher mission, some belief that the bodies he left behind had it coming. He just did it, understood exactly what he was doing, and kept going anyway. But the next man on this list built his entire identity on the opposite lie. The idea that his violence was never murder at all, that he only ever took people who deserved it, right up until the bodies stacked up who never hurt a soul in their life. Dexter Morgan Dexter. A man kills roughly 130 people over the course of his life and gets to call it a code. Not a spree, not a rampage, a code. That one word did more work than any defense attorney ever could, and for 8 seasons, it worked on the audience just as well as it worked on Dexter himself. Dexter Morgan spends his days at Miami Metro reading blood spatter for a living, and his nights creating more of it for other people to read someday. Harry's code was supposed to be the whole point of the character. Only kill killers, only take the guilty, never miss, and never, under any circumstances, get caught. It sounds like restraint. It sounds like a man locked in a permanent war with his own nature and somehow winning that war every single night, year after year, without ever slipping once. It is neither of those things, not even close. It is a story Dexter tells himself so the killing feels like justice instead of appetite, a private mythology built to keep the monster looking reasonable to the one person who actually has to live with him. The code breaks the exact second it becomes inconvenient, and it breaks early. Dexter kills a man who attempted rape but had not actually killed anyone, which is not justice, that's just a technicality with a knife attached to it. He tampers with evidence constantly, redirecting Miami Metro's own investigations to protect himself from the police force he technically works for. That means every single time his code demanded a fresh body, the actual justice system got quietly sabotaged in the background, no exceptions, no exclusions. Real victims in real cases buried under a serial killer's need to stay gainfully employed as a blood spatter analyst. Add that to the list, then Season 4 happens, and the code stops being a private hobby with a body count and starts costing other people absolutely everything they have. Dexter finds the Trinity Killer, and instead of ending him fast the way the code demands, he studies him instead. He wants a mentor. He wants to understand a killer who has evaded capture for decades, and that curiosity alone buys Trinity extra time walking around free in the world. Extra time that Trinity uses to murder Dexter's wife Rita in their own bathroom, with their infant son sitting in her blood on the floor. Dexter didn't pull that trigger, or in this case, swing that blade. He built the conditions for it, chasing his own fascination with a fellow killer, and Rita paid the entire bill for a lesson Dexter wanted to learn purely for himself. That's the family the Code was supposedly out there protecting the whole time. That's the wife who trusted a husband selling her a version of normal that never once existed, right up until the exact morning it got her killed. Skip forward to New Blood, over a decade later, and the mask doesn't just slip. It comes off completely in front of everyone who ever believed in it. Cornered, facing real jail time for the first time in his life, Dexter kills Sergeant Logan. Not a killer, not a monster, a cop doing his actual job. 130 bodies deep into a crusade built entirely on only taking the guilty, and the second, his own freedom becomes the price. The Code evaporates instantly like it was never really there at all. His son Harrison watches the pattern finally complete itself in real time, watches the Code fail the one test it was actually built for, and ends up being the one who kills him. Tony Soprano at least knew exactly what he was. He looked in the mirror and saw a killer looking back, no performance required, no code needed to soften the view. Dexter needed the story. He needed, I only take monsters the way other men need a religion, because strip that belief away and what's left is just an appetite wearing a lab coat and a badge. Take the Code out of the equation entirely and you're left with a man who murdered a cop to save his own skin, then acts genuinely stunned when the people who loved him finally stop believing the lie he's been selling them for years. Dexter needed a Code to live with himself, a story that made the killing feel like justice instead of what it actually was. But the last man on this list needed no such story, no Code, no cover at all. He looked the people who loved him dead in the eye and finally said the quiet part out loud, that he never did any of it for them in the first place. Walter White, Breaking Bad. A man dying of cancer tells his wife he is doing this for the family, and by the end he has poisoned a child, ordered 10 murders in under 2 minutes, and let a young woman choke to death on his living room floor while he watched. Then, years later, sitting across from that same wife, he finally tells the truth. I did it for me, I liked it, I was good at it. 52 minutes of finale, and that is the line that changes everything that came before it. Start with the body count, because it earns the confession. In Season 4, he uses Lily of the Valley to poison Brock Cantillo, a child who was never a target, purely to manipulate Jesse Pinkman into turning on Gus Fring. That is not collateral damage. That is a calculated decision to hurt a kid because it moves the pieces where Walter wants them. In Season 5, he orders coordinated hits on 10 inmates, all executed within about 2 minutes, just to seal off any thread that leads back to him. 2 minutes. That is barely enough time to microwave a burrito, and Walter used it to erase 10 witnesses. Go back further, and it gets worse, because the earliest sin is the quiet one. Season 2, Jane Margolis is choking on her own vomit, and Walter stands there and does nothing. He lets her die. That single choice ripples outward through her father's grief until it contributes to a mid-air collision over Albuquerque that kills 167 people who had never heard of Walter White, and never would. Compare that to Tony Soprano smothering Christopher, or Dexter watching his Code crumble under pressure. Those men needed a trigger, a betrayal, a threat. Walter needed a woman inconvenient to his plans, and he let physics take care of the rest. By the finale, he has millions of dollars sitting in a storage unit, a brother-in-law dead in the desert because of him, a neo-Nazi gang he armed and empowered, and a family that will never say his name again without flinching. He kills that gang eventually, rigging an M60 in the trunk of his car like some kind of vengeful mechanic, but only after they had already done his killing for him. Even his last act of cleanup arrives late, dressed up as Justice. Fans have spent years arguing over Walter's point of no return. Some say it's Jane, some say it's Brock. Some say the cancer diagnosis was never really the reason at all, just the excuse he needed to stop pretending to be satisfied with his life. Follow the pattern and there's only one place it leads. The resentment was there before the diagnosis, sitting quietly under 2 decades of watching other men get rich off ideas he helped build. The cancer didn't create Walter White, it just gave him permission. That is what separates him from every man before him in this ranking. Don Draper buried his shame in reinvention. Jax Teller called his violence loyalty. Nucky Thompson called it business. Tony called it family. Dexter called it code, right up until the code broke and showed nothing underneath it but appetite. Every single one of them needed a story. Walter is the only one who eventually looked directly at his wife and at us and dropped the story completely. That's the answer sitting underneath this entire ranking. Every one of these men swore he had no choice, that the wife, the son, the family made him do it, and every one of them used that story to explain away the people who paid for it, the ones who trusted him, the ones who just happened to be standing nearby. Walter is the only one who finally admitted there was a choice all along, and that he made it because he wanted to. He didn't break bad because of cancer, or money, or family. He said it himself, he was good at it, and it made him feel alive. The reluctance was the last con. And once you hear the confession, every "I had no choice before him" sounds like the same lie told quieter. If you enjoyed this video and want to see more, click the video on the screen now.